Hey guys, Greg Knuckles here with stringtheory.com, and what I have for you today is a Q&A video about the Bulgarian method. As most of you probably know, Omar Isaf and I recently released a free Bulgarian training manual, link will be in the description, and thus far it's already been downloaded over 16,000 times, so a lot of questions have rolled in, and the purpose of this video is to answer as many of them as possible, especially the ones that have come up frequently. So the first question that's come up a lot has to do with deadlifts. The Bulgarian method for powerlifting, as we lay it out in the manual, primarily revolves around squatting and pressing. And people who like the deadlift, they're a little bit peeved that, hey, we only recommend pulling once or twice a week, submaximal, not really the type of brutal deadlift workouts that they're used to. So they're asking, is there any way that we can pull more frequently or work harder deadlift workouts into the overall plan? And yes, you can. If you want to pull more frequently, what I would recommend is doing them clean pull style, kind of like a weightlifter. Deadlifts tend to be more fatiguing if you're really pulling max weights or pulling sets close to failure where your back rounds a little bit. And that rounding of your back, your spine going through flexion and extension instead of just being held isometrically, that tends to be more fatiguing on your back than even pulling a lot of reps with really, really clean form. So I would recommend, if you want to pull more frequently, stay a long way away from failure with pretty manageable weights. And like I said, pull kind of like an Olympic style clean pull where there's no flexion all up and down the spine, even in the thoracic region, which tends to be more acceptable for powerlifting style deadlifts. If you do want to work harder deadlift workouts into the overall setup of the Bulgarian method, the way we lay it out, just be aware that your squats will probably be affected for at least 2 or 3 days afterwards. So you'll want to be more conservative with your daily minimum, because your daily, what you're capable of doing the day or two after a hard deadlift workout will be knocked down considerably. So you'll want to be more conservative with your daily minimum, and also just be aware that your daily maxes will probably be affected for a couple days after a hard deadlift workout, and it may be wise just to hit the daily minimum and wrap it up for that day or two after. So what you're dealing with there is kind of a trade-off. You can work the heavier deadlifts in if you want to, but that will decrease how often you can train your squat really hard. So if that's a trade-off you're fine with, that's okay. And if not, just keep that in the back of your mind and train the deadlift more conservatively the way it's recommended in the manual. Okay, second question that's come up a lot has to do with calculating training volume and its importance in the overall setup. So one of the things I talk about in the manual is training volume on the Bulgarian method, just like every other style of training, is still the main driver of progress. So if you're stalling, the main way to keep moving forward is to increase your training volume. So the questions have been like, how rigorously do I need to calculate that? Is that something that I need to increase rigidly in regular intervals or something like that? And the answer to that is no. And really, the training volume of any given day isn't overly important because you're training the lift so frequently. However, it's probably a good idea to keep a rolling average of how many drop back sets you're doing for each lift each week, and just have that in the back of your mind. And if you're still making progress, basically just allow that to auto-regulate and you'll be fine. If you find that you've been stalled for 2, 3, 4 weeks, and you look back at how many drop back sets you're doing and it's been pretty much flatlined, then it would probably be a good idea to push those a little bit harder and maybe do 1 or 2 extra drop back sets per workout that you wouldn't typically do, just to make sure you're getting some extra volume in to keep that weekly rolling average moving up. And then as you establish that higher level of volume, you'll start making progress again, and just hold there until you plateau again, and then increase volume and rinse and repeat. So the next question a lot of people have been asking has to do with accessory lifts. The Bulgarian method for powerlifting, as we've laid it out, primarily just revolves around squatting and pressing. And so people are asking, well, that obviously leaves a lot of muscles untrained, so what do we do about those? So really just a general rule of thumb is you can do whatever you want to for those muscles as long as it doesn't take away from the quality of work that you can do for your main lifts. So, let's say you want to do some extra back work. You want to work your lats a little bit harder. If you can do, let's say 2 or 3 sets of rows or pull-ups, and you come in the next day, your lats aren't sore, you can still squat and bench fine, then that's fine, and that's a perfectly acceptable thing to do. If you do that same amount of volume and your lats are really sore and you find it harder to keep your torso stable and solid when you're squatting, or your shoulders feel a little bit loose when you're benching, then that was probably a little bit too much. And just like the squatting and benching, any level of work that you're doing for those other muscles, start conservatively and increase over time as you're able. And it's always best to err on the side of too little rather than too much when you're first starting out. And then as you kind of see what your body's comfort zone is with those lifts, just increase those over time as you're able. Okay, another question that's come in quite a bit is, would you recommend Bulgarian style training when training for insert sport here? It could be anything. Some people have asked about running, some people have asked about football or wrestling, things like that. I would say no. And the reason for that is I would not recommend any type of powerlifting program while you're training specifically for another sport as your primary focus. And the reason for that is any good program that focuses on a particular physical attribute, in this case powerlifting and strength, or it could be anything, a good running program, for example. What that specialty program is doing basically is pushing your recovery ability basically to the limit. If you can do more and you're not doing more, then you're not getting as much as you can out of the program. So by their very nature, most powerlifting programs, this included, are having you do powerlifting things basically to the edge of your recovery. Any good running program will be having you running basically to the edge of your recovery, because if you could do more and you're not, then the program's not as effective as it could be. So if you're training for, say, 2 sports at the same time, or if you want to do something like the Bulgarian method plus train for running or train for another sport, that's probably not a particularly good thing to do, because if you're doing a specialty program like the Bulgarian method that focuses primarily on strength, and that's pushing you to the very edge of your recovery ability, as it should be, then when you add on the extra stress of the other sport or the extra stress of running or anything like that, that's going to tip you over the edge of what you'll be able to recover from. And if it doesn't, that's a good indicator that you weren't pushing as hard on the program as you should have been in the first place. So my recommendation would be to seek out a program that is tailored specifically to, say, increasing strength in the context of the practice of the broader sport that you're trying to improve at. And just to give credit where credit's due, I think this is kind of a concept that a lot of people have had in the back of their minds, but I've heard it most clearly articulated by Alex Viada of Complete Human Performance. So just to give credit where it's due, that's who really helped distill that idea for me. Another question that's come up a lot has to do more generally with training frequency, and is it necessary to train lifts this often if you want to get stronger? And unequivocally, my answer is no. If you look back through time, most great lifters have trained their squat, bench, deadlift once or twice a week, sometimes 3 times, but there have been plenty of people who got brutally strong without this type of training frequency. All we were really trying to do here is lay out, if you're interested in this style of training, here's how you can implement it. It can help you get strong. Other things can help you get strong. Certainly not saying that Bulgarian style training is the way you have to train if you want to get stronger. Just simply that if it's a style of training that interests you, the manual will teach you how to implement it intelligently if that is the style of training that appeals to you. But again, making no claim that it's how you have to train if you want to get stronger. Another question that's come up pretty often is, how infrequently can you get away with training? Because the Bulgarian team, they trained 7 days a week, 2 or 3 times a day most days, and obviously most of us don't have time to do that. So people are asking, can I do this if I'm training, if I can only get in the gym 5 days a week or 4 days a week, or what is that bottom end cutoff? And just based on experience, it seems to be about 4 times a week. 5 to 6 for most people seems to be the sweet spot if you can pull it off, but people also make great progress with this style of training 4 times a week. In my experience, 3 times a week doesn't tend to work quite as well, and really 3 times a week doesn't necessarily qualify as high frequency training in the first place. Not saying it can't work for you, it's just that, again, just based on what I've seen helping people through this style of training and talking to people who have done it and asking for their experiences, it seems like about 4 times a week is the bottom end cutoff for how frequently you need to train those lifts to get the most benefit from them. Another question that's come up a lot has to do with the overhead press. The manual was primarily written to powerlifters and using Bulgarian style training for powerlifting. So most of what we talked about in the manual was primarily talking about the bench press when we discussed pressing. However, if the overhead press is a higher priority to you, basically everything we say about bench pressing, you can just sub in overhead pressing there and it all applies. A few people have also asked about benching and overhead pressing and how to train both of those simultaneously. My recommendation would be to pick the one you want to focus on the most and do that for every training day except maybe 1 or 2, and then do the other lift just once or twice a week. You could split it up where you're basically doing it 50-50, but again, just based on my experience with people who've worked through this style of training, that doesn't tend to give enough frequency in the specific motor patterns to have as good of carryover as training a lift at least 4 times a week. So, if you can get to the gym 6 times a week and overhead press is your priority, but you also want to get your bench up, then 4 times a week overhead pressing and twice a week benching, or 5 and 1, that tends to work fine and tends to work better than 3 and 3. What I've seen happen most often is if you're, trying to serve 2 masters at the same time, you tend to get really good overhead progress or really good bench progress if you're focusing on that one, and then moderate progress on the other one if you're only doing it once or twice a week. Whereas if you're just doing both of them, 2 or 3 times a week, and not really focusing on one or the other, you tend to get that moderate, not so great progress for both of them. Okay, the last one, this has actually been asked about a dozen times, which is on par with a lot of the other questions, even though I'm pretty sure it's a joke question, but I'll still give it a serious answer. People have asked about what type of beer you should drink when you're doing this type of training, and this can be very stressful training, and it requires adequate calories to replenish. So I would recommend sticking primarily with imperial stouts and quads, Belgian quadruples, as beer pairings for this type of training. You might be able to get away with tripels or maybe imperial IPAs, but those big hearty beers tend to pack more calories in and help you recover from this style of training better. And people have also asked, what is the maximum amount of beer I can drink? Which is a good question, because obviously with any type of training program, a very high priority is being able to drink as much as possible and still be able to make progress. And for that, I would basically say, obviously, never drink enough that you wind up with a hangover, and stick to 2 or 3 standard drinks per day. And if you're going with those imperial stouts and quads, since they have 10% ABV or above, typically 12 ounces of those you need to count as 2 standard drinks, because, well, it has twice as much alcohol as fake beer. And by fake beer, I mean most beer. So, stick to 2 or 3 drinks a day. It's probably not going to affect your recovery very much, but it will very much benefit your enjoyment of this type of training or any type of training, and just life in general. So that's it, guys. Thanks for watching. Like I said, the manual is free. Links in the description. If you have any more questions, ask them in the comments below. Please like and subscribe. And that's all I got. Thanks, guys.